weigh, balance it, but you got to make up your own mind. He continues, who shall say what prospect life offers to another? Could a greater miracle take place than for us to look through each other's eyes for an instant? We think of course, of our comments, Robert Burns' To Allow, so go back and take a look at that lecture if you need to. That notion of, for a few moments, to be able to see the world through somebody else's eyes, or to see ourselves the way somebody else sees us. He said we should live in all the ages of the world in an hour, in the worlds of the ages. History, poetry, mythology, and then you get your exclamation point. Thoreau loves his exclamation points, right? I know of no reading of another's experience so startling and informing as this would be. He says a few lines later, how vigilant we are, determined not to live by faith if we can avoid it, all the day long on the alert. At night, we unwillingly say our prayers and commit ourselves to uncertainties. So thoroughly and sincerely are we compelled to live, reverencing our life and denying the possibility of change. This is the only way we say, but there are as many ways as there can be drawn radii from one center. All change is a miracle to contemplate, but it's a miracle which is taking place every instant. Confucius said, and this is one of the reasons we love Thoreau, quoting from the Eastern text, from the non-Western text all the time, and he took a copy of the Bhagavad Gita with him to Walden, right? He says, Confucius said, to know that we know what we know, and that we do not know what we do not know, that is true knowledge. Now, of course, this takes us back to Socrates, to Plato's Apology. The one thing I know is I don't know anything. It's a compelling thing to know what you don't know, because then you can obviously begin to address it. He says, when one man has reduced a fact of the imagination to be a fact to his understanding, I foresee that all men will at length establish their lives on that basis. Well, obviously, it's a compelling idea, right? To be able to try and figure out what you don't know and then pick up with what you don't know and try to address it in some way. Talking about the rich, he says it this way a few lines later, the luxurious rich are not simply kept comfortably warm, but unnaturally hot. As I implied before, they're cooked, of course, a la mode. Most of the luxuries and many of the so-called comforts of life are not only not indispensable, but positive hindrances to the elevation of mankind. With respect to luxuries and comforts, the wisest have ever lived a more simple and meager life than the poor. And the idea is, of course, get rid of all the things that would somehow keep you chained up, right? He'll call it voluntary poverty a few lines later. He says, there are nowadays professors of philosophy, but not philosophers. Yet it's admirable to profess, because it was once admirable to live. To be a philosopher is not merely to have subtle thoughts, nor even to found a school, but to love wisdom as to live according to its dictates, a life of simplicity, independence, magnanimity, caring about others, and trust. I mean, there it is. In other words, you can study this stuff or you can live this stuff. He challenges us, obviously, to do a little bit of both. A few lines later, he says it this way, I do not speak of those who are well employed in whatever circumstances, and they know whether they are well employed or not, but mainly to the mass of men who are discontented and idly complaining of the hardness of their lot of the times when they might improve them. Again, the theodicy question here, right? There are some who complain most energetically and inconsolably of any, because they are, as they say, doing their duty. I also have in my mind that seemingly wealthy but most terribly impoverished class of all, who have accumulated dross but know not how to use it or get rid of it, and thus have forged their own golden and silver fetters. We make our own chains, in other words. A few lines later he says, to anticipate, not the sunrise and the dawn merely, but if possible, nature herself, exclamation point. How many mornings, summer and winter, before yet any neighbor was stirring about his business, have I been about mine? Now, some people don't like this about Thoreau, that he seems to be bragging about himself. But I think that's an unfair critique of Thoreau. He's going to make this argument. Get up in the morning and wake up. Literally, physically, but as well emotionally, spiritually. In other words, the first thoughts that you think in the morning should be something akin to, let's have an adventure, as opposed to, another crummy day. The way you think in the opening minutes of the morning will determine in large measure what it is that you're going to see in your day for the rest of your day. Certainly his idea. I mean, and here again, he'll challenge us to say, experiment with that idea. Go ahead and try to wake up in the morning and the first thoughts that you have are, this is going to be a great day. And then watch to see if you could make that true. Now, so much of economy And this is why I think you need to read this as the first chapter in Walden. So much of economy is setting up ideas that we're going to see later throughout the poem. I call it a poem sometimes because it's an essay that reads like a prose poem. We're going to see more of this, a waking up idea of waking up, all right? He says a few lines later, because obviously he's got to address, why'd you go to Walden Pond and live for 2 years and 2 months and 2 days? He says, my purpose in going to Walden Pond was not to live cheaply, nor to live dearly there, but to transact some private business with the fewest obstacles, to be hindered from accomplishing which, for want of a little common sense, a little enterprise and business talent, appeared not so sad as foolish. In other words, he says, you know, I wanted to try and figure some stuff out, and the only way I could do that was on my own. He says a few paragraphs later, no man ever stood the lower in my estimation for having a patch in his clothes, talking now about the needs that so many people feel to buy new clothes all the time. Yet I'm sure there is greater anxiety commonly to have fashionable or even less clean and unpatched clothes than to have a sound conscience. That is to say, in other words, it's a whole lot more important the clothes that you wear on the spiritual side than the physical side. Finally, he says it this way, a man who has at length found something to do will not need to get a new suit to do it in. For him, the old will do. That has lain dusty in the garret for an indeterminate period. Old shoes will serve a hero longer than they have served his valet. If a hero ever has a valet, bare feet are older than shoes, and he can make them do. Only they who go to soirees in legislative halls must have new coats to change as often as the man changes in them. What a great line. But if my jacket and trousers, my hat and my shoes are fit to worship God in, they will do. Will they not? Whoever saw his old clothes, his old coat actually worn out, resolved into its primitive elements, so that it was not a deed of charity to bestow it on some poor boy, by him perchance to be bestowed on some poorer still, or shall we say richer, who could do with less. I say, beware of all enterprises that require new clothes, and not rather a new wearer of clothes. If there is not a new man, how can the new clothes be made to fit? If you have any enterprise before you, try it in your old clothes. All men want not something to do with, but something to do, or rather, something to be. Now this is, of course, brilliant transcendental philosophy. Instead of worrying so much about what's going on the outside, to be truly authentic, spend more time thinking about what's going on the inside. It's an interesting idea. He says, I believe that all races at some seasons wear something equivalent to the shirt. It's desirable that a man be clad so simply that he can lay his hands on himself in the dark, and that he can live in all respects so compactly and so preparedly that if an enemy take the town, he can, like the old philosopher, walk out the gate empty-handed without anxiety. Simplify, simplify, simplify will, of course, be the famous line in Walden over and over again, this idea. He says it this way, every generation laughs at the old fashions, but follows religiously the new. I think that's an interesting idea, right? And then he says, in the long run, men hit only what they aim at. Therefore, they that should fail immediately, they had better aim at something high. And of course, this notion of aiming your dreams high will be central to our reading of Walden. A few lines later, he says, at last, we know not what it is to live in the open air, and our lives are domestic in more senses than we think. From the hearth, the field is a great distance. It'd be well, perhaps, if we were to spend more of our days and nights without any obstruction between us and the celestial bodies. If the poet did not speak so much from under a roof, or the saint dwell there so long. Birds do not sing in caves, nor do doves cherish their innocence in dovecotes. This notion that, in other words, you got to get out in the world, and you got to live a life that is engaging the world, especially the world of nature. Of course, many have argued that Thoreau is the first great ecologist, right? Talking directly to us about the need to enjoy nature, be outside. He says it this way, and when the farmer got his house, he may not be the richer, but the poorer for it, and it be the house that has got him. He says, while civilization's been improving our houses, it's not equally improved the men who are to inhabit them. It has created palaces, but it was not so easy to create noblemen and kings. Well, this is an interesting idea. In other words, think about obviously, we know this idea, this Thoreau idea from our studies and comments with Jordan Peterson. Clean up your room, no doubt about it. But not just your physical room, right? That is to say, simplify the interior room as well. He says, I would rather sit on a pumpkin, famous line, and have it all to myself, than to be crowded on a velvet cushion, that notion of self-reliance. He says, men have become the tools of their tools. The man who independently plucked the fruits when he was hungry has become a farmer, and he who stood under a tree for shelter a housekeeper. We now no longer camp as for a night, but we've settled down on earth and forgotten heaven. We've adopted Christianity merely as an improved method of agriculture. We have built for this world a family mansion, and for the next a family tomb. The best works of art are the expression of man's struggle to free himself from this condition, but the effect of our art is merely to make this slow state comfortable and that higher state to be forgotten. Well, obviously we saw lines very much like this in our study of walking as well, didn't we? Now I'm going to move quickly to the end of economy. His record keeping takes him to in all $28.12.5. It's fun stuff. He spends some time talking about what it was like to be a student at Harvard, and then he will begin his final comments. He says, I'm wont to think that men are not so much the keepers of herds as herds are the keepers of men. The former are so much the freer. We'll remind ourselves that it's Whitman's I think I could turn and live with the animals that will sound very much like this idea. He says, speaking of animals, that man is an animal who more than any other can adapt himself to all climates and circumstances. It is this adaptability of humans that makes for Thoreau the human mind so amazing. Now to finish, he says, for more than 5 years I maintained myself thus solely by the labor of my hands, and I found that by working about 6 weeks in a year, I could meet all the expenses of living. The whole of my winters as well as most of my summers I had free and clear for study. I have thoroughly tried school keeping and found that my expenses were in proportion, or rather out of proportion, to my income, for I was obliged to dress and train, not to say think and believe accordingly, and I lost my time into the bargain, as I did not teach for the good of my fellow men, but simply for a livelihood. This was a failure. And of course, all of us who are teachers take very seriously these lines as to what it is to be a legitimate teacher. In short, he says a few lines later, I'm convinced, both by faith and experience, that to maintain one's self on this earth is not a hardship, but a pastime, if we will live simply and wisely, as the pursuits of the simpler nations are still the sports of the more artificial. It is not necessary that a man should earn his living by the sweat of his brow unless he sweats easier than I do. And then a few lines later he says it this way. He says, I desire that there be as many different persons in the world as possible. Now this is huge, because many think that Thoreau wrote Walden to make you be like him. Not at all. Not at all. You've got to find your own experiment. He says, I want all of us to be as different as possible. But, he said, I'd have each one be very careful to find out and pursue his own way. We think, of course, of Whitman's Song of Myself, passage 46 and 47. No doubt, that destroy the teacher passage. You have to find your own way. I hear you're asking me questions. I cannot answer. You must find out for yourself. The speaker, teacher in Whitman will say, right? You got to find your own way. Pursue your own way. Not his father's or his mother's or his neighbor's instead. The youth may build or plant or sail. Only let him not be hindered from doing that which he tells me he would like to do. As we've often said, and Thoreau certainly teaches this in Walden, once you've figured out what it is you don't believe in, you don't like, you don't want to do, the stories you are hoping to reject, the next obvious, really important question is, okay, what do you believe? What will you do? It's not enough, he says, to live a life of being the naysayer, the no, I don't do that, I don't believe that. Fine, so what do you believe? That's the key, right, for him. And he wanted to know that for himself, right? He says, what good I do in the common sense of that word must be aside from my main path, and for the most part wholly unintended. Men say practically, begin where you are and such as you are, without aiming mainly to become of more worth, and with kindness of forethought to go about doing good. If I were to preach it all in this strain, I would say rather set about being good as opposed to doing good. He says, there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who's striking at the root. And it may be that he who bestows the largest amount of time and money on the needy is doing the most by his mode of life to produce the misery which he strives in vain to relieve. There's been a whole lot of criticism, of course, of this idea that when you simply give the needy people money, you're not really giving them what they ultimately need. It's an interesting debate, right, that Thoreau will pick up with. He says, I never knew and never shall know a worse man than myself. Now this is again part of that epistemological fallibilism to end the chapter on economy. Well, how are we going to finish? Well, obviously we're now introducing ourselves to Walden. And what is it that we learn? Well, 3 things. 1, at level 2A. Your life is your life. That is to say, live your life. Number 2, your life has never been your life. 2 people had to hook up and exchange fluids to produce you. You didn't choose that. That means your life has always been our life. That is to say, we're all in this thing together. And because we're in this thing together, we've got to find a way to coexist, to get along, to be together. Number 3, this life that is your life, this life that is our life, this life has to be the future. It's got to be about looking high, aiming high, looking for something of the future. And I think this is why reading economy at the beginning of this text is so vital, because now that Thoreau has kind of set the tone, he's ready to answer the real fundamental question. Why'd you go to the woods? And he will say it. I went to the woods because I wished, I longed, I wanted to live deliberately. Let's come back and talk about deliberateness and intentionality, and of course we're going to sound a whole lot like some of the things we've said about Plato's Republic. Thank you.